The Great Hall of the Galactic Concord stretched across 3 kilometers of polished obsidian and living crystal. And within its walls, the fate of countless worlds had been decided over the past 100,000 years. Though today, the ancient chamber would witness something none of its architects had ever imagined, Ambassador Elena Vasquez stepped through the towering entrance gates and felt the weight of 1,000 alien eyes turning toward her, their gazes carrying everything from mild curiosity to open contempt. And she kept her spine straight and her expression calm as she led her small delegation forward. The human contingent numbered only 6 individuals, a tiny group compared to the sprawling delegations of the elder species, who filled the curved benches that rose like waves on either side of the central walkway. And Elena could feel her team's nervousness, even without looking at them. 12 years, she thought to herself. Just 12 years since humanity had stumbled into the galactic community and discovered they were not alone in the universe. And in that brief span of time, they had learned so much about the galaxy and its ancient civilizations. The Valkyrie watched from the highest tier, their compound eyes glittering like clusters of black diamonds, and their iridescent wings folded tight against their backs in the formal posture of senior arbitrators. For they had founded the Concord when humanity's ancestors were still learning to make. Fire-High Arbiter Kethvalen sat at the center of the Valkyrie delegation. His mandibles clicking softly, in what Elena had learned was an expression of bored patience. And he regarded the approaching humans with the interest one might show a particularly unremarkable insect. To the left sat the Dromori, tall and willowy beings with skin like moonlight and eyes that held the depth of ancient oceans. And they communicated through a combination of speech and telepathy that allowed them to read the surface thoughts of most species. Though they found human minds disturbingly chaotic, Elder Sylvath of the Dromori tilted her elongated head as Elena passed, and the ambassador felt a gentle pressure against her thoughts. A polite telepathic greeting that she acknowledged with a small nod while keeping her mental barriers firmly in place. The Korvathi occupied an entire section of the lower benches, their massive reptilian bodies armored with natural plates that had evolved over millions of years of warfare. And they watched the humans with undisguised amusement, for they considered these soft pink creatures to be barely worthy of notice. War Chief Gromek leaned toward one of his advisors and made a rumbling comment that Elena could not hear but could easily guess. Since the Korvathi had never hidden their opinion that humans were fragile, short-lived, and utterly insignificant in the grand scheme of galactic power, 17 major species held seats in the Galactic Concord, and each one had existed for thousands upon thousands of years, building empires that spanned hundreds of star systems, while humanity had only just begun to explore beyond their own solar system. Elena reached the speaker's platform at the center of the Great Hall and took her position behind the crystalline podium that had been used by ambassadors since before Earth had continents, and she allowed herself a moment to appreciate the weight of history that surrounded her. The session had been called to discuss trade, agreements, and border disputes, the ordinary business of galactic civilization. But Elena had requested time on the agenda for a different matter entirely, one that had kept her awake for the past 3 nights. High Arbiter Kethvalen's voice resonated through the chamber with the authority of his ancient office as he called the session to order and began reciting the formal protocols that governed all Concord proceedings. His words translated simultaneously into hundreds of languages by the hall systems. Elena waded through the preliminary matters with growing impatience, watching as disputes over mining rights and navigation lanes were debated and resolved according to precedents established millennia ago, and she felt time slipping away like sand through her fingers. Finally, the arbiter acknowledged her request to address the assembly, and he granted her 3 minutes according to standard protocol for junior species, a limitation that many of the elder delegates clearly considered more than generous. Elena stepped forward and activated the holographic display system, projecting images that filled the center of the Great Hall with terrible clarity, showing burning cities and fleeing civilians and death on a scale that made several delegates look away. "These images come from the Selvani homeworld," Elena began, her voice steady despite the horror of what she was showing. "A planet called Vareth in the outer spiral arm, home to a peaceful species who had only just begun to dream of reaching the stars." The Selvani appeared on the display. Small beings with 4 arms and large dark eyes that held an intelligence and gentleness that transcended the boundaries of species. And they were running through forests that burned with unnatural fire. 6 months ago, the hegemony of Reth arrived in the Selvani system with a fleet of warships, and they began a systematic campaign of extermination that has already claimed the lives of 40 million innocent people. Elena continued, letting the weight of that number hang in the air. The hegemony was well known to the Concord, a brutal empire that had conquered dozens of systems through overwhelming force and ruled its territory through fear and violence. Though they had never directly threatened any Concord member, world murmurs rippled through the assembly as delegates conferred with their advisors. But Elena noticed that none of them seemed particularly disturbed by what they were seeing, and that observation sent a chill down her spine. "The Selvani have committed no offense against the hegemony," she pressed on. "They have no military forces, no weapons of significance, and no ability to defend themselves against the assault they now face. And every hour that passes sees more of them die." She paused to let the images speak for themselves, showing hegemony soldiers marching through Selvani villages, showing mass graves being filled with small bodies, showing a civilization being erased from existence with cold efficiency. "I am here today to propose that the Galactic Concord authorize an immediate military intervention to stop this genocide," Elena declared. "A coalition fleet under Concord authority that will halt the hegemony's campaign and protect what remains of the Selvani people." The chamber fell silent, and Elena could see the elder delegates exchanging glances that carried meaning she could not fully read, though she sensed something like weary resignation in many of their expressions. High Arbiter Kethvalan rose from his seat with the deliberate grace of his kind, his wings catching the light as he addressed the assembly in tones of practiced neutrality. "The representative of Earth has made a proposal for military intervention in a conflict that does not involve any member species of the Concord," he announced. "We will now hear responses from the member delegations." Elder Sylvath of the Dromori spoke first, her voice carrying the musical quality of her people, and she expressed what she called profound sorrow at the suffering of the Selvani, while explaining that intervention would destabilize trade routes that the Dromori had spent centuries cultivating war. Chief Grumak of the Kurvati laughed openly at the proposal, his deep voice echoing through the chamber as he declared that the weak existed only to fall before the strong, and that the Selvani's extinction was simply the natural order asserting itself one by one. The delegations gave their responses, and one by one they found reasons to refuse, citing protocols and precedents and practical concerns that masked what Elena was coming to recognize as simple indifference. The Valkyries spoke of their founding principles of non-interference in the affairs of non-member species. The Dromori worried about economic disruption. The Kovathi celebrated the violence as natural selection, and the others fell into line with various excuses. Elena watched the final vote with a numbness that slowly gave way to something hotter and more dangerous, as 17 species chose to do nothing while millions died. And she understood for the first time what humanity had truly stumbled into when they joined the galactic community. The galaxy was ancient and powerful and utterly, completely broken in ways that had nothing to do with technology or resources, for it had simply decided long ago that some lives did not matter. And that decision had become law. High Arbiter Kethvalan formally recorded the vote and prepared to move on to the next item on the agenda, dismissing the deaths of millions with the same casual efficiency that he might use to file a trade dispute. Elena remained at the podium. Her 3 minutes long expired, but her presence not yet acknowledged, and she felt the eyes of the galaxy upon her as she made a decision that would change everything. The silence that followed the vote stretched across the great hall like a living thing, and Elena Vasquez could feel it pressing against her skin as she stood at the podium where countless ambassadors had stood before High Arbiter Kath Valen's compound eyes fixed upon her with growing irritation as he waited for her to step down and return to her delegation's modest seats in the lower tiers of the assembly. Ambassador Vasquez, he said with the careful patience one might use with a particularly slow child, your time has concluded, and the matter has been decided according to established protocol. So I must ask you to yield the floor. Elena did not move from her position, and she felt her team tense behind her as the weight of what she was about to do settled across her shoulders like a cloak woven from fire and steel. I have a question for the assembly, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's perfect acoustics, and I believe I am entitled to ask it before I yield. Murmurs of surprise rippled through the gathered delegates, for it was exceedingly rare for a junior species representative to press for additional time after a vote had concluded, and several of the elder species shifted in their seats with expressions of disbelief. Kethaval's mandibles clicked sharply, and what Elena had learned was the Valkyrie expression of severe displeasure. But protocol did allow for a single question following any vote, a courtesy that had been established so long ago that most delegates had forgotten it existed. Very well. The High Arbiter conceded with obvious reluctance. You may ask your question, though I caution you that the Assembly's patience is not unlimited. Elena looked around the great hall, meeting the eyes of delegates who had watched civilizations rise and fall across spans of time that made human history seem like the blink of an eye. And she wondered how many genocides they had witnessed from these very seats. My question is simple, she said, and her voice carried a quality that made several of the telepathic Dromori flinch. How do you live with yourselves? The chamber erupted into chaos, with delegates shouting in a dozen languages and translators struggling to keep up with the sudden surge of outrage. While Elena stood calmly at the center of the storm she had created, War Chief Gromuk rose to his full imposing height and bellowed something about human arrogance, while Elder Sylveth pressed her long fingers to her temples as if the emotional turbulence in the room was causing her physical pain. High Arbiter Kethvalen struck the ceremonial chime that called for order, and its pure tone cut through the noise like a blade, restoring a tense and angry silence to the assembly. You forget yourself, Ambassador, he said, and his voice had lost all pretense of patience. The Concord has maintained peace and stability across this galaxy for 100,000 years. And we do not answer to a species that has barely learned to leave its own planet. Elena smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression, for it carried within it all the weight of human history and all the fury of a species that had learned long ago to turn its rage into something far more dangerous than simple violence. You speak of peace, she replied. But what you mean is comfort, because peace would require justice and stability would require action. And you have built your civilization on the principle that neither of those things is worth any real effort. She gestured toward the holographic display that still showed the horrors being visited upon the Selvani homeworld. The image is frozen in place like a wound that refused to close. The Selvani are dying right now, at this very moment, while we stand here discussing protocol and procedure. And every one of you has decided that their lives matter less than your convenience. Elder Sylveth rose from her seat with fluid grace, her pale features arranged in an expression of carefully modulated sympathy that did not quite reach her ancient eyes. We understand your distress. Ambassador, for your species is young and has not yet learned the hard lessons that time teaches all civilizations. And we know that you cannot see the broader patterns that guide our decisions. Elena turned to face the Dromori elder directly, and she felt the telepathic probe that attempted to read her emotions. Though she made no effort to block it this time, "What I see," Elena said slowly, "is a galaxy full of ancient and powerful civilizations that have decided it is easier to watch children die than to risk their own comfort. And that tells me everything I need to know about the lessons time has taught you." The Dromori elder recoiled slightly, and Elena knew that her words had struck deeper than any physical blow could have. For the Dromori prided themselves on their empathy and compassion. "We are not heartless," Sylveth protested. "We feel the suffering of the Selvani as keenly as you do, perhaps more so given our telepathic sensitivity. But we have learned through bitter experience that intervention often causes more harm than it prevents. That is what you tell yourselves." Elena agreed, "And I am sure it helps you sleep at night. But the truth is that you have simply grown so old and so comfortable that you have forgotten what it feels like to care about anything beyond your own preservation." Ward Chief Gromak laughed at this, his booming voice echoing through the chamber with genuine amusement at what he clearly saw as Bullman. "Human naivety. The little pink creature speaks of caring," he rumbled, "as if emotion has any place in the affairs of nations and empires, when the truth is that strength is the only currency that matters in this galaxy." Elena turned to face the massive Korvati warrior, and she did not flinch from his predatory gaze, even though he stood nearly 3 meters tall and was covered in natural armor that could deflect most energy weapons. "You mistake kindness for weakness," she said, "which is a common error among those who have never faced an enemy that fights for something greater than territory or resources." Gromak's eyes narrowed with sudden interest, for he was a warrior who had lived for over 800 years and had learned to recognize danger in all its forms. "And what do humans fight for, little ambassador, that makes you so confident in the face of beings who could crush your entire civilization without breaking stride?" Elena's smile grew wider, and something in her expression made several of the nearby delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. "We fight for each other," she said simply, "and for those who cannot fight for themselves. And that is something you will never understand, because you have never had to claw your way up from nothing with nothing but stubbornness and rage." She paused and looked around the chamber once more, taking in the ancient species who watched her with expressions ranging from contempt to confusion to something that might have been the beginning of fear. "Humanity is young by your standards, and we are small and weak and fragile compared to the empires you have built. But we carry something within us that all your millennia of existence have slowly erased from your souls." High Arbiter Kethvalin leaned forward with obvious skepticism, his compound eyes glittering with intellectual curiosity beneath his irritation. "And what might that be, ambassador, that you believe we have lost and you still possess?" Elena stood straight and tall at the podium, and when she spoke, her voice rang through the great hall with a conviction that made the air itself seem to vibrate. "The willingness to die for something that matters," she declared, "and the absolute refusal to accept that anything is inevitable simply because it has always been that way." She turned to her delegation, meeting the eyes of each of the 5 humans who had accompanied her to this place, and she saw in their faces the same fierce determination that burned within her own heart. "We came here hoping that the galaxy would prove to be better than our worst fears suggested," she continued, "and instead we have discovered that you have grown so ancient and so powerful that you have forgotten how to be brave." The chamber had fallen utterly silent, and Elena could feel the weight of 1,000 alien minds focused entirely upon her, waiting to see what this strange young species would do next. "The vote is concluded, and the Concord has spoken," she said. And humanity accepts that we cannot change your decision through words alone. But I want you all to remember this moment. She began walking toward the great doors at the far end of the chamber, her delegation falling into step behind her like a guard of honor at a funeral. Remember that you had the power to stop a genocide and chose not to use it. And remember that we asked you to help us save innocent lives, and you refused. She reached the doors and paused, turning back one final time to face the assembly of ancient powers who had ruled the galaxy since before humanity existed. When you see what comes next, she said, remember that you made this necessary. And with those words, Ambassador Elena Vasquez led the human delegation out of the Galactic Concord Assembly, and the great doors closed behind them with a sound like the ending of an age. The doors of the Galactic Concord Assembly had barely closed behind the human delegation when the chamber erupted into a chaos of voices and emotions that tested even the translation system's ability to keep pace. High Arbiter Kethvalen struck the ceremonial chime repeatedly in an attempt to restore order. But the delegates were too agitated to respond to the usual protocols, and the sound of 100 simultaneous arguments filled the ancient hall. Elder Sylveth of the Dromori had gone pale, even by the standards of her species, her hands trembling slightly as she conferred with her advisors in rapid telepathic exchanges that left visible ripples in the air around them. What did you sense from her? Demanded one of her aides when she made those final statements at the doors. Sylveth shook her head slowly, and her expression carried something that her people had not experienced in living memory, something that looked very much like genuine fear. I could not read her thoughts clearly, she admitted, for human minds are always difficult for us. But I felt her emotions with perfect clarity, and what I sensed was not anger or despair or the wounded pride we expected. The aide leaned closer with obvious concern, for the Dromori elder had advised 7 generations of Concord leadership and had never before seemed so unsettled. What did you sense then, elder, that troubles you so deeply? Sylveth turned to look at the great doors through which the humans had departed, and her ancient eyes held the weight of terrible knowledge. Certainty, she whispered. Absolute and unshakable certainty that they are about to do something that will change everything. And she was not afraid of the consequences because she believes completely in the righteousness of her cause. Across the chamber, War Chief Gromak had gathered his warriors around him and was speaking in low growls that his translator chose not to broadcast to the wider assembly. I do not like this, he admitted to his most trusted advisor, for I have seen that look before in the eyes of enemies who are about to attempt something desperate and dangerous. His advisor, a scarred veteran named Thrall, who had fought in a dozen campaigns, scratched thoughtfully at the ridge of bone that protected his skull. The humans have no real military force to speak of, he pointed out, and their ships are crude things held together with primitive technology. So what could they possibly do that would concern the mighty Korvati? Gromak bared his teeth in what might have been a smile or a grimace, for among his people the expressions were often indistinguishable. The humans have something that concerns me more than ships or weapons, he growled, and that is the madness of a species that has not yet learned what is impossible. For such creatures are capable of actions that no reasonable mind would ever consider. High Arbiter Kethvalen finally managed to restore a semblance of order to the chamber, his authority reasserting itself as the initial shock of the human departure began to fade. This assembly will come to order, he commanded, for we have business yet to conduct, and the theatrical display of a junior species should not be allowed to derail our proceedings. But even as he spoke the words, the ancient Valkyrie found himself troubled by a sensation he had not experienced in over 2,000 years of service to the Concord. He was uncertain, and that uncertainty gnawed at him like a parasite that had found its way past all his carefully constructed defenses. The humans spoke of consequences, observed Ambassador. Velthan of the Korvathi Diplomatic Corps. But they have neither the ships nor the soldiers to challenge the hegemony of Reth. So their threats must be nothing more than empty posturing. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber, for this logic seemed sound to species, who had learned long ago to calculate power in terms of fleet, sizes and weapons yields and industrial capacity. The hegemony commands over 1,000 warships, continued Velthan, and their armies have conquered dozens of worlds, while humanity's entire combined fleet numbers less than 100 vessels, and their military forces could not secure a single planet against determined opposition. The delegates nodded, and their tensions began to ease as they reminded themselves of the fundamental reality of galactic power, which was that the strong did as they wished and the weak endured what they must. But in the small chamber adjacent to the main hall, a Dromori observer named Keflia was reviewing the historical files that the Concord maintained on every known species. And what she found there turned her blood to ice. "Elder Sylveth," she called out through their telepathic link, "I need you to see something immediately, for I believe we have made a terrible mistake in our assessment of the humans." The elder excused herself from the ongoing debates and joined her young assistant in the observation chamber, where holographic displays filled the air with data and images from humanity's short but violent history. "What have you found?" Sylveth asked. "That concerns you so greatly?" Keflia gestured toward the displays with hands that shook slightly despite her efforts to remain calm. "I have been reviewing the records of human history since they achieved spaceflight," she explained, "and I noticed several patterns that do not match our standard models for species development." She highlighted a series of entries that chronicled humanity's journey from their first tentative steps into space to their discovery of the galactic community 12 years ago. When we first made contact with the humans, they had already begun construction of what they called defensive platforms throughout their home system. Massive structures armed with weapons that seemed disproportionate to any threat they could have been aware of. Sylveth studied the data with growing unease, for it was unusual for a newly spacefaring species to invest so heavily in military infrastructure before encountering any external threats. They claimed these installations were for asteroid defense. Keflia continued, and we accepted that explanation because it seemed reasonable. But look at the weapons specifications. The holographic display zoomed in on technical readouts that showed the defensive platforms bristling with kinetic accelerators and missile systems and directed energy weapons that could devastate entire fleets. "These are not asteroid defense weapons," the young Dromori said quietly. "These are ship killers designed to engage enemies in space combat. And the humans built them before they even knew that alien civilizations existed." Sylveth felt a chill run through her as the implications of this discovery began to unfold in her ancient mind. They prepared for war before they knew there was anyone to fight. She breathed, as if they simply assumed that the universe would prove hostile and acted accordingly. Keflia nodded and brought up additional records that showed humanity's industrial expansion since joining the Concord. Charts and graphs that had been overlooked because no one had thought to look for them. In the 12 years since first contact, human industrial output has increased by 400%, she reported, with the majority of that increase directed toward what they call infrastructure development in their outer colonies. She paused and met her elder's eyes with an expression that mixed fear with a strange kind of admiration. But when I cross-referenced their shipping records with our surveillance data, I found that the materials being sent to these outer colonies do not match any standard infrastructure requirements, for they are shipping refined metals and weapons-grade composites and fusion reactor components in quantities that suggest only one possible purpose. Sylveth understood immediately, and she felt the bottom drop out of her carefully ordered universe. They have been building a war fleet in secret, she said, hiding their preparations behind a facade of peaceful development while the entire galaxy dismissed them as harmless primitives. Kathleen brought up the final piece of evidence, a holographic projection that showed the estimated size of humanity's hidden military force based on the materials that had been transported to their outer colonies. If our calculations are correct, she said, the humans have constructed between 600 and 1,000 warships over the past 12 years, along with ground forces numbering in the millions. The two Dromori stared at the display in silence, their minds struggling to process the implications of what they had discovered. They knew, Sylveth whispered. From the moment they joined the Concord, they knew that someday they would meet the fight. And they have been preparing for that day ever since, while we smiled and dismissed them as children. In the main chamber, the assembly continued its debates and discussions, with delegates congratulating themselves on their wisdom and refusing to be drawn into humanity's emotional crusade. None of them noticed the urgent message that Sylveth sent to High Arbiter Kethvelen, warning him that the galaxy had fundamentally misunderstood what humanity was and what they were capable of, and none of them knew that even as they spoke, the first human warships were already burning toward the Selvani homeworld at speeds that should have been impossible, their crews preparing for a battle that would shake the foundations of galactic civilization. The humans had asked for help and been refused, so now they would help themselves. And the galaxy would learn the hard way that underestimating humanity had always been a fatal mistake. The hegemony Death Fleet hung in orbit above the Selvani homeworld like a crown of thorns pressed against the skull of a dying planet. And Admiral Crothman surveyed his conquest with the satisfaction of a predator finishing its meal. 60 warships had been more than sufficient to break the Selvani's primitive defenses. And now the final phase of the extermination was proceeding according to schedule, with ground forces methodically cleansing the remaining population centers. How long until the operation is complete? Krathvan demanded of his tactical officer, a younger hegemony soldier who had proven useful for his attention to detail. Another 3 weeks at current pace. Admiral, though we could accelerate if you authorize the deployment of our orbital bombardment systems against the remaining civilian concentrations. Krathvan considered this option with the casual disregard for life that had made him one of the hegemony's most feared commanders, weighing the efficiency gains against the slight possibility of useful slaves being lost. Before he could respond, his sensor officer called out with sudden alarm in his voice, "Admiral, we are detecting multiple hyperspace emergence signatures at the edge of the system. Far more than should be possible for any known fleet movement." Krathvan turned to his displays with annoyance rather than concern, expecting to see perhaps a Concord observation vessel or a lost trading convoy that had stumbled into the wrong sector. What he saw instead made his blood freeze in his veins. Ships were appearing at the system's edge in numbers that defied comprehension. Vessel after vessel dropping out of hyperspace in formations so tight and precise that they seemed to move as a single organism. "How many?" he demanded, his voice suddenly hoarse. 300 warships confirmed and still counting, Admiral, with configurations that match no known design in our databases, though preliminary analysis suggests they are of human origin. The bridge fell silent as every officer present struggled to process this impossible development, for humanity was known throughout the galaxy as a minor species with no significant military capability. The humans have no fleet, Krathvan insisted, clinging to the certainty that had guided his entire career. Our intelligence reports confirm they possess fewer than 100 vessels, and none of them are combat capable. His communications officer looked up from her console with an expression that mixed fear with something that might have been awe. "Admiral, we are receiving a transmission from the human fleet, broadcast on all frequencies and directed at both our forces and the planetary surface below." "Put it through," Krathvan commanded, hoping that this was some kind of bluff that he could call. With overwhelming force, The main display flickered and resolved into the image of a human female in military uniform, her face hard and her eyes carrying the cold fire of absolute commitment. This is Admiral Sarah Chun of the United Earth Defense Force, commanding the 1st Expeditionary Fleet, the woman announced, her voice carrying clearly across every receiver. In the system, the Silvani people are now under human protection, and you have exactly 1 hour to withdraw your forces from this system before we remove them permanently. She paused and smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had been waiting a very long time for this moment. I understand you may have difficulty believing this message, so let me be absolutely clear about what is about to happen, for we did not come here to negotiate, and we did not come here to threaten. We came here to end this. Admiral Krathvan stared at the display with his mind racing through tactical calculations that refused to add up to any outcome except disaster. Your fleet outnumbers ours 5-1, he said, opening a response channel. But the hegemony does not retreat before primitive species who barely understand the weapons they carry. Admiral Chun's expression did not change, and something in her stillness was more frightening than any display of anger could have been. I was hoping you would say that, she replied, because my soldiers have been watching your forces murder innocent civilians for 6 months while we built this fleet and trained for this battle. She leaned forward, and her eyes held a fury that transcended personal emotion and became something almost holy in its intensity. They need to see you die, and I am more than happy to give them what they need. The transmission ended, and for a long moment, no one on the hegemony bridge moved or spoke. Admiral, the tactical officer said finally, what are your orders? Krathvan made his decision with the arrogance that had carried him through 100 successful campaigns. All ships form battle line and prepare to engage. For these humans may have numbers, but they lack experience, and their technology is primitive compared to ours. He settled back into his command chair with what he hoped was an expression of confident authority. We will teach them why the hegemony has ruled its sector for 3,000 years. What followed would be remembered in galactic histories as the most one-sided engagement since the fall of the Korvathi Empire. Though not in the direction that Admiral Krathvan had anticipated, the human ships came in fast and hard, their formations adapting in real time to every maneuver the hegemony attempted, and their weapons fire was devastatingly accurate despite the supposed primitiveness of their targeting systems. The first hegemony cruiser died within minutes of the engagement, torn apart by a barrage of kinetic rounds that punched through its shields like they were made of paper and shredded its hull from bow to stern. How is this possible? Krathvan demanded as ship after ship winked out of existence on his tactical display. Their technology should not be capable of this level of performance. His tactical officer was working frantically at his console, trying to find some weakness in the human attack pattern that could be exploited. Admiral, their ships appeared to have triple redundancy on all critical systems, and their weapons are achieving penetration values that our shields were never designed to handle. The human vessels were ugly things by galactic standards, all sharp angles and exposed armor plating that showed none of the elegant curves favored by the elder species. But they absorbed damage that would have destroyed any hegemony ship and kept fighting. One human destroyer took a direct hit from a hegemony capital ship's main cannon, a blow that should have vaporized it instantly, but instead the vessel listed to one side, vented atmosphere from a dozen wounds, and then straightened its course and continued its attack run. Their crews are dying in those ships, the sensor officer reported with disbelief in his voice. But they are not breaking off. They are continuing their attacks even as their vessels disintegrate around them. Krathvan watched as his fleet crumbled before an enemy that simply refused to stop. That took every blow and answered with 10 of their own, that fought with a fury and determination that no amount of training could explain. This is not possible, he whispered as another of his ships exploded. They should be running. They should be surrendering. No species fights like this. But the humans were not like other species, for they had been forged in a crucible of endless war and hardship that had burned away everything except the absolute refusal to yield. The battle lasted 11 hours, and when it was over, there were no hegemony survivors, not because the humans were incapable of mercy, but because they had watched the Selvani die for 6 months, and they had decided that some crimes could only be answered with extinction. Admiral Chun broadcast a second message as her fleet took up defensive positions around the Selvani homeworld, this one directed at the galaxy at large. This is Admiral Sarah Chun of the United Earth Defense Force, and I am announcing that the Selvani system is now under human protection. She paused and let the weight of what she was about to say settle across every receiver that was monitoring this channel. The hegemony fleet that came here to commit genocide has been destroyed, with no survivors, and any force that threatens the Selvani people from this point forward will receive this same treatment. Her eyes seemed to look directly into the soul of every being who heard her words. The humans asked the Galactic Concord for help and were refused. So we helped ourselves, and I want every civilization listening to this message to understand exactly what that means. She held up a data crystal that sparkled in the light of her bridge. We did not fight this battle alone, for we fought with the memories of every genocide that the galaxy has watched and done nothing to stop. And we fought with the rage of every innocent life that was deemed acceptable collateral damage by ancient species who had forgotten how to care. The transmission ended, and across the galaxy 1,000 different civilizations began to realize that something fundamental had changed in the order of the universe. The humans had arrived, and they would not be ignored any longer. 6 months had passed since the Battle of Selvani Prime, and the galaxy had not stopped talking about what the humans had done, for it was the kind of event that forced every civilization to reconsider everything they thought they. New Ambassador Elena Vasquez walked once again through the great doors of the Galactic Concord Assembly, and this time, the eyes that followed her carried something very different from the contempt and dismissal of her previous visit. The human delegation had grown since that fateful day, now numbering over 24 diplomats and advisors who followed Elena through the chamber with the quiet confidence of those who knew their own worth high. Arbiter Kethvalen watched their approach from his elevated position, his compound eyes unreadable, but his posture betraying a tension that had not been there. Before, Elena did not wait for permission to approach the speaker's podium, for she had learned that in the politics of the galaxy, respect was taken rather than given. 6 months ago, I stood in this chamber and asked for your help. She began, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. And you refused because the Selvani were not members of your Concord and their lives did not matter to you. She paused and looked around at the assembled delegates, taking her time to meet the eyes of those who had voted against intervention. I promised you then that you would see what comes next, and I trust you have been paying attention to events in the Selvani system since that day. Holographic displays activated around the chamber, showing images that told a story of transformation and hope rising from the ashes of Genocide Selvani. Children in schools built by human engineers, learning alongside young humans who had volunteered to teach them about the galaxy that had almost let them de-Selvani. Farmers working fields that had been cleansed of hegemony, contamination by human environmental teams, growing crops that would feed a population that had been pushed to the edge of extinction. Selvani leaders signing treaties and trade agreements with Earth, their large dark eyes shining with a gratitude that needed no translation. The Selvani people will survive, Elena announced, not because of anything the Concord did, but because humanity refused to let them die alone. Elder Sylveth of the Dromori rose from her seat with the slow deliberation of someone who had spent 6 months preparing for this moment. We I've watched the humans with great interest since the battle, she admitted. And we have come to understand that we misjudged your species in ways that we are still struggling to comprehend. She spread her hands in a gesture that conveyed both surrender and acknowledgement. The Dromori offer our formal apology for our failure to act, and we pledge to reconsider our approach to future crises that may require intervention. This was more than Elena had expected, and she nodded in acceptance, even as she noted that apologies would not bring back the millions who had died before the human fleet arrived. War Chief Gromuk also rose, though his expression was harder to read beneath his natural armor. The Kovathi do not apologize for our position, he growled, for we still believe that strength is the foundation of all civilization. But we acknowledge that the humans have demonstrated strength beyond what we credited them with possessing. He bared his teeth in what might have been respect. We will be watching you closely in the years to come, for you have proven yourselves to be worthy of our attention, if not yet our full respect. Elena accepted this as well, understanding that for the Kovathi such words were practically a declaration of admiration. High Arbiter Kethvalon cleared his throat in the matter of his species, drawing the chamber's attention back to official proceedings. The matter before the Assembly today is the formal application of the Salvani species for membership in the Galactic Concord, he announced, submitted with the sponsorship and endorsement of the United Earth Government. He paused and looked at Elena with an expression that seemed to contain the weight of 100,000 years of galactic history. This is unprecedented, for no junior species has ever sponsored a new member. But given the circumstances, we have agreed to consider the application under special provisions. Elena smiled, and this time it was a genuine expression of satisfaction, rather than the cold promise she had shown 6 months ago. The Salvani meet all the standard criteria for Concord membership, she stated, and their application should be considered on its merits rather than on the circumstances of their recent history. The debate that followed was surprisingly brief, for the Salvani had become a symbol that no delegation wanted to be seen opposing when the final vote was called. 17 species voted in favor of admitting the Salvani to the Galactic Concord. With no abstentions and no votes against, Elena watched the formal ceremony that welcomed the Salvani into the community of spacefaring civilizations, and she felt a warmth in her chest that had been absent for far too long. But she was not finished, and when the ceremony concluded, she once again took her place at the speaker's podium. I have one more matter to bring before this assembly, she announced. Though this one is not a formal proposal, but rather a promise. The chamber fell silent, for the delegates had learned to pay close attention when humans made promises. Humanity did not come to the stars looking for enemies, Elena said. And we did not build our fleet because we wanted war. But we have learned through bitter experience that the universe does not care about our hopes, and that peace must sometimes be won through force. She gestured toward her delegation, where military officers stood alongside diplomats and scientists. We are prepared to defend any species that cannot defend itself, whether they are members of this Concord or not, because we believe that the measure of a civilization is not how it treats the powerful, but how it protects the weak. High Arbiter Kethvalon leaned forward with obvious concern. You are proposing to act outside the authority of the Concord whenever you see fit, which is a direct challenge to the order that has maintained peace for 100,000 years. Elena met his compound eyes without flinching. I am proposing that the definition of peace should include those who are being slaughtered by empires like the hegemony, and that if this Concord will not protect them, then humanity will do so in their stead. She softened her expression slightly, for she had not come here to make new enemies. But I am also proposing something else, something that I hope will make such unilateral action unnecessary in the future. She turned to address the full assembly rather than the High Arbiter alone. The Concord was founded on principles of non-interference. That made sense when the galaxy was young and civilizations were still learning to coexist. But those principles have become an excuse for inaction in the face of atrocity. She pulled up a document on the holographic display, showing a proposed amendment to the Concord Charter. Humanity is formally proposing the creation of a new protocol, one that would authorize Concord intervention in cases of genocide or mass atrocity, regardless of whether the victims are member species. The chamber erupted into discussion, with delegates conferring urgently with their advisors and several species. Immediately calling for points of order, Elena let them talk, for she knew that this proposal would not pass today and might not pass for decades. But the seed had been planted, and humans were nothing if not patient. Eventually, High Arbiter Kethvalal restored order and addressed the assembly with words that surprised everyone present. The proposal will be referred to committee for study and debate, he announced. And while I cannot predict the outcome of those deliberations, I acknowledge that recent events have demonstrated the limitations of our current protocols. He looked at Elena with an expression that mixed grudging respect with something that might have been the first stirrings of genuine curiosity. The humans have given us much to think about. And perhaps, after 100,000 years, it is time for the Concord to consider new ways of doing things. Elena bowed formally to the High Arbiter and to the assembly, then turned and led her delegation toward the great doors. But before she reached them, a young Velkari diplomat approached her with obvious nervousness. Ambassador Vasquez, he said, I wanted to tell you that not all of us agreed with how the assembly handled the Silvani situation, and many of us have been inspired by what your species has done. Elena stopped and looked at the young alien with genuine warmth. What is your name? She asked. Kethvin, he replied. And I hope to work toward the day when our species can stand together against injustice rather than watching from the sidelines. Elena placed her hand on his shoulder in the human gesture of friendship and solidarity. That day will come, she promised, because the galaxy is changing. And the change is being driven by beings like you who refuse to accept that things must always be as they have been. She walked out of the assembly hall and into a future that held both challenges and opportunities, knowing that humanity's work in the galaxy had only just begun behind her. The great doors closed on a chamber full of ancient powers who were just beginning to understand that the universe had shifted. Beneath their feet, the humans had arrived, and nothing would ever be quite the same again.